Hey guys, alright? Welcome everyone. On a beautiful day, Julia informs Mr. Rourke that the plane they were waiting for has finally arrived. The man then prepares his team to welcome their guests, Melanie, JD, Brax, Patrick, and Gwen, who won a contest to stay on Fantasy Island. Julia introduces herself to the winners as Rourke's assistant, saying he will meet them later before taking them to their rooms. At the same time, a man named Damon watches them from a distance. Moments later, half-brothers Brax and JD wait at the bar while the other guests settle into their rooms. Meanwhile, Julia tells Gwen that Rourke tailors each fantasy specifically for the guest, adding that her life will change forever. Then, Julia's nose bleeds as she leaves, but she just wipes it and keeps walking. As Julia leaves, Gwen notices some footprints in the bathroom and sees a burned man in the mirror, but he quickly disappears. That night, the guests gather at the bar while waiting for Rourke. There, JD reveals to Patrick how his father married Brax's mother when he was still a child, and the men introduce themselves to each other. Meanwhile, Melanie asks Patrick what his fantasy is, wondering what his room will be like, but he doesn't know how everything works. So, Melanie says it's virtual reality, and Patrick starts to think it will be some kind of immersive experience. However, Gwen wants to know if the fantasy will involve someone from their lives. Fortunately, Rourke finally appears to answer their questions. After introducing himself, Rourke reveals that there is only one fantasy per guest and that they must see it through to its natural conclusion. He also adds that fantasies rarely unfold as anyone could expect, but they always unfold exactly as they should. At the same time, Rourke says that everything will start after a good night's rest, but since JD and Brax still don't have their rooms, the host informs them that their fantasy is about to begin. A few minutes later, the brothers follow Rourke outside. As they walk, JD keeps calling Brax T, an old nickname that he hates. Then, Rourke takes the brothers to a party in a mansion, revealing that their fantasy is to have it all. As he leaves, JD celebrates with different women, and Brax enjoys the company of men. After a while, Brax sees a burned man arriving at the mansion, but thinks his eyes are just playing tricks on him. The next day, Rourke calls Gwen to his office, where he talks about her fantasy of having a second chance. Then, Rourke discovers that she rejected a marriage proposal before. Rourke wants to know if Gwen would say yes if she could relive that moment, and when she says yes, he takes her to a room where her fantasy awaits. Behind the doors, Gwen finds her ex-fiancé, Alan, waiting for her in a restaurant. Then, upon reaching the table, Gwen is confused because Alan is being nice to her, even though she hasn't spoken to him in 5 years. However, Alan has no idea what she's talking about and says he saw her in his bed that morning. Realizing that it's all not real, Gwen tries to talk to Rourke and says it's not what she wanted. However, the host simply tells her not to ruin her second chance to say yes to Alan's marriage proposal, adding that everything is as real as she makes it seem on Fantasy Island. Meanwhile, Patrick joins Melanie while she drinks and finally reveals his fantasy of enlisting. But his mother made him promise he wouldn't do it, so Patrick became a police officer and got stuck behind a desk. On the other hand, Melanie admits that her fantasy is to get revenge on her attacker, Sloane. Melanie had to see a therapist whom she refers to as Dr. Torture because of Sloane and now wants to feel what it's like to be on the other side. As if on cue, Rourke appears and instructs Melanie to go to the elevator and press the button for the nameless floor. Melanie then notices water dripping inside the elevator, and upon reaching the designated floor, she starts recording and puts her phone on a shelf. She then hits a button and finds Sloane in another room separated by glass, gagged and tied to a chair. Melanie thinks Sloane is just a hologram and reads the note left for her, stating that she can press buttons for various kinds of revenge. Eager for revenge on Sloane, Melanie presses a button that electrocutes her attacker. Next, she presses more buttons to continue torturing Sloane and eventually sees a video of her with a man who is not her husband, and becomes happy posting it online. After that, Melanie presses another button and sees footage of Sloane's husband, Will, watching the leaked video of his wife and calling to ask if that's where she has been for the last 2 days. At that moment, Melanie realizes something is wrong and presses another button, and sees a video of Sloane being kidnapped. Thus, she quickly calls Rourke and says it's over, unable to believe that the host would actually kidnap Sloane. Meanwhile, Rourke takes Patrick to the forest, where Damon warns him that the entire island is not what he thinks it is. However, their conversation is interrupted by some soldiers, so Damon immediately hides. Patrick tries to tell the soldiers that he's part of a covert operation, but the men don't believe him and take him with them. Back at the restaurant, Gwen finally accepts Alan's marriage proposal, despite knowing it's just a fantasy. At the same time, the half-brothers find a hidden room, and inside it, there's another special room containing many weapons. Brax decides to grab a grenade, and both head outside excited. JD launches the grenade into the water using a baseball launcher. Meanwhile, Patrick finally meets the leader of the soldiers, Lieutenant Sullivan. It's clear that Patrick instantly recognizes the man as his father and demands to see Rourke, shouting that this isn't what he asked for. Then, Sullivan sees his name on Patrick's identification tags and asks how this happened, but they soon come under attack by their enemies. Patrick can only stand there while the men exchange gunfire and, unfortunately, he gets shot and passes out. On the other hand, a surgeon suddenly enters Sloane's room. Melanie then bangs on the glass to prevent the surgeon from harming the woman, but ends up discovering that the man is Dr. Torture. However, Dr. Torture ignores her and cuts Sloane's arm, then Melanie hits a button, which triggers a loud alarm and distracts the doctor. After that, Melanie instructs Dr. Torture to cut off Sloane's right ring finger, but when he is about to do it, Melanie hits a button and electrocutes him. She also hits another button to drench him with water, and once he loses consciousness, Melanie grabs her phone and breaks the glass separating her from Sloane to help the girl escape. Simultaneously, everything turns chaotic in the mansion when one of Brax's models is shot, so they immediately head to the panic room. Then, Brax calls Rourke and informs him about their situation. Then the host says the invaders are probably Kalashov's men. Kalashov used to own that house, and Rourke adds that the trouble with having it all is that other people usually want to take it from you. Unfortunately, the panic room closes while Rourke and Brax talk, leaving the half-brothers outside. Brax is now in a panic, but the host reminds him that they must see their fantasy through to its natural conclusion and ends the call. Unfortunately, it doesn't take long for Kalashov's men to find JD and Brax. On the other hand, Sloane tries to understand how Melanie ended up on the island, thinking she was also kidnapped. However, Dr. Torture soon arrives and tries to kill Sloane, but Damon saves them by stabbing the doctor. He then tells the girls to come with him, and they quickly follow him. Meanwhile, Gwen has a nightmare about the burned man strangling her before waking up next to Alan. But despite this, Gwen just tells Alan to go back to sleep. In the forest, Patrick regains consciousness and starts walking upon hearing a sound, only to be strangled by the burned man. However, he soon realizes it's just a dream, but he doesn't even have time to think about it because Sullivan wants to talk to him privately. Sullivan wants to know why Patrick has a picture of him and his son, so Patrick says it's him when he was 9 years old. However, Sullivan doesn't believe Patrick and shows him his ID, asking why he has his son's name and date of birth. Unsure how to prove he is Patrick Sullivan, Patrick tells his father things only he would know. Eventually, the lieutenant believes Patrick, and Patrick realizes his true fantasy is to see his father. So, Patrick tells Sullivan that he died saving his men on a classified mission in Venezuela, and Sullivan says they will go there the next day. The following day, Gwen wakes up and sees a photo of her with Alan, realizing they are already married. Unable to believe it, Gwen decides to talk to Rourke, but the host reveals that they have been married for 5 years, adding that they have a daughter named Lila. Curious, Gwen sees more photos of her family on the phone and begins to have flashbacks, remembering Lila as she grew up. Meanwhile, Rourke reveals the powers of the island, saying he sought it out with his wife years ago. However, she died before they reached the island, so when he discovered that place, he wished for her to live again and return just as he knew her. However, Rourke has to stay on the island to be with his wife forever and orchestrate the fantasies of the guests. In the forest, Sullivan starts to leave with Patrick. However, Patrick tells Sullivan that his men will die without him, revealing that he was killed by throwing himself on a grenade to save them. But despite this revelation, Sullivan is determined to go home with his 9-year-old son. Then, Patrick tries to stop Sullivan from leaving, and as the two engage in a physical struggle, Patrick points a gun at his father and says he will help him complete his mission. On the other hand, the half-brothers try to explain to the armed men that they don't know Kalashov. However, the leader of the men, Devil Face, doesn't believe them and starts slicing JD's arm when he says he has no idea where their money is. Thus, JD lies and says it's down there, but Devil Face is still skeptical and takes Brax with him to look for the money. Meanwhile, Gwen feels guilty for having the chance to live with Alan and Lila. She then talks to Rourke and asks for a new fantasy, but the host reminds her that guests can only have one. Concurrently, Damon takes Melanie and Sloane to a cave, where Sloane is followed by an evil version of herself. A few minutes later, Melanie sees a burned man while crossing dirty water in the cave. However, she chooses to ignore him, and soon they find a glowing stone over a mineral water spring. Damon explains that the water grants the deepest desire of anyone, adding that he was hired by a client to discover what's happening in that place. Damon was skeptical at first, but soon saw his dead daughter when his fantasy began. Unfortunately, his fantasy turned into a nightmare, and Rourke destroyed his satellite phone when he tried to call for help. Knowing how to stop Rourke, Damon collects some of the mineral water, which can bring a loved one back to life and turn them into a black-eyed zombie. Damon instructs Melanie to call the pilot he knows as soon as they reach the hotel and smuggle the water off the island, making Sloane realize she wasn't kidnapped. Then, the stone shows that Melanie's fantasy was to ruin Sloane's life, and the two girls get into an argument over this. However, as they are running out of time, Melanie ends up asking Damon to take her back to the hotel. On the other hand, Gwen finds a sick Julia and helps her before saying she wants a new fantasy. Gwen then reveals that someone died in a fire because of her, and pleads with Julia to let her correct that moment. After that, Gwen confronts Rourke and demands the second chance she truly wanted. She returns her wedding ring and heads to another room. However, Gwen notices the black water dripping from the ceiling, but that doesn't stop her from reliving her fantasy. Gwen tries to save her neighbor, Nick Taylor, from the fire in the building where she lives, and she encounters JD and Brax on the stairs. However, they don't recognize her, so Gwen proceeds to Nick's unit and ends up going back outside to ask a police officer for help to open the door. Then, Gwen realizes that the officer is Patrick, who also doesn't recognize her and says they should just wait for the firefighters. Frustrated, Gwen goes back to her unit to grab a hammer, only to pass out seconds later. Meanwhile, Brax runs and hides in the armory, where he grabs a gun to shoot one of Devilface's men. On the other hand, a zombified Dr. Torture attacks Damon and eventually stabs him, but that doesn't stop him from pushing the doctor off a cliff. Unfortunately, that also costs him his life, so Melanie makes sure he doesn't die in vain and grabs his map. Meanwhile, Patrick helps Sullivan and his men rescue some hostages in Venezuela, who turn out to be JD and Brax. However, Patrick thinks Brax is one of the villains because he is wearing a mask and holding a grenade. Carelessly, they allow Devilface and his henchmen to knock them down. But Patrick and Brax react, while Sullivan and his team rescue JD and the models. Unfortunately, they don't know that every villain they kill turns into a black-eyed zombie. Outside, Patrick finally kills Devilface and his henchmen just as Sullivan and his team arrive. Unfortunately, the black-eyed zombies start appearing, killing JD and Sullivan's men. Sullivan then orders Patrick to leave, and Patrick can only watch in horror as the zombies shoot his father to death before finally fleeing with Brax. At the same time, Melanie and Sloane return to the torture room, where Melanie calls Will. Sloane tells Will she was kidnapped and asks for his help, apologizing for betraying him. Then, she instructs him to call the number Damon gave to Melanie and ask for a plane. On the other hand, Gwen is saved by Julia. However, Gwen can't help Nick, and that's when she realizes it's someone else's fantasy. Meanwhile, Brax and Patrick find Melanie and Sloane, and they all quickly head to the dock. Unfortunately, Rourke and his men intercept them in the lobby, where Gwen confronts the host about their fantasies. Gwen now knows they were brought there because of Nick, who turns out to be Brax and JD's roommate. Gwen admits she accidentally caused the fire in the building and also points out that Patrick was there but didn't do anything. Melanie reveals she was supposed to have a date with Nick that night but got nervous. Now that the guests know it's all just a big revenge fantasy because everyone has a part in Nick's death, Rourke admits it will all end with their deaths. Then, Damon's plane finally arrives, and Patrick confronts Rourke's men while the others escape. Fortunately, Patrick is able to flee when Julia appears, and Rourke simply lets him go. Unfortunately, the plane is shot down by Devilface, who attacks the guests and forces them to run and hide. They then rest near the waterfalls, where everyone wonders who Julia is, as Gwen thinks it's strange she saved her. Then, Melanie shows the spring map with an ancient stone, and Sloane says that her water makes the fantasies possible. So, they plan to destroy the spring using a grenade and quickly head for the cave. Unfortunately, everyone separates as soon as they enter the place. Patrick is pulled down underwater by several hands, and it doesn't take long for him to come face to face with a zombified Sullivan. On the other hand, Sloane picks up the canteen Melanie dropped before facing her evil version. Unfortunately, as Sloane tries to deal with her inner demon, she is attacked by Dr. Torture. Meanwhile, Brax talks to a zombified JD, who blames him for his death. However, Brax is forced to run when Devil Face appears and shoots JD. At the same time, Gwen follows Lila's voice and finds her killing Alan. Nick then appears and holds Lila's hand, and while he refuses to accept Gwen's apologies, he says he isn't responsible for what's happening to them. At the same time, Patrick manages to drown Sullivan, but Melanie suddenly appears and stabs him repeatedly. Gwen quickly searches for Patrick upon hearing his screams and encounters Brax, and it doesn't take long for Melanie to appear with Dr. Torture and Sloane. It's clear that Melanie has already taken Patrick's grenade. It turns out that everything is Melanie's fantasy, and she actually likes Nick. Unfortunately, he died before they could go out together, and she blames the other guests for it. However, Sloane distracts Melanie so that Brax and Gwen can grab the knife and her grenade. Gwen then punches Melanie while Brax stabs Dr. Torture, and Sloane quickly escapes with them. The trio searches for the spring and luckily escapes from Devil Face and the dark copy of Sloane. Then, upon finding the spring, Rourke appears and reveals that Julia is his fantasy because she is his wife. However, Rourke's wish was to have her back just as he knew her, so Julia would appear not knowing him before falling ill and dying again. Unfortunately, after telling this story, Rourke grabs Gwen's grenade and says he has no choice but to give Melanie her fantasy because that is the price he must pay to be with Julia. Seconds later, Melanie arrives with her henchman, and Rourke throws the grenade with its pin into the spring. However, Julia talks to Rourke as he walks away, pleading with him to let her go and save the guests. Meanwhile, a wounded Patrick tries to convince Melanie to let the others go as soon as Rourke returns, and the host tells everyone that the guests are entitled to a fantasy. Because of this, Sloane drinks the spring water from the canteen, revealing that her fantasy is for Melanie and Nick to be together. Then, a burned Nick pulls Melanie toward the spring, and the black-eyed zombies eventually disappear. However, Melanie makes one last effort to get revenge on the guests and throws the grenade on the ground, leaving Patrick no choice but to sacrifice himself to save his friends. Then, the next day, Gwen, Brax, and Sloane learn from Rourke that Patrick died a hero. After that, Rourke finally lets the guests leave, as they will not remember the island, but Brax decides to stay to be with JD, even if it's just a fantasy. Thus, JD reappears and takes the women off the island, while Brax starts working for Rourke as his new assistant and uses the name Tattoo, the nickname his half-brother gave him.